All right, if you would open your Bibles to Luke chapter 18 again. We're going to be moving down into verse 9 this week. So this will be Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. If you don't have your Bibles, it is up on the screen. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. God bless your word to us this morning. So here we have this parable that Jesus gives. These 2 men come into the temple, the place of worship, the place where all the Jews would come together to worship, to offer sacrifices, to do all of these things. And then the Pharisee, who by anyone's standards was a more righteous man than the tax collector. He didn't extort people, he didn't steal, he didn't use his money for sinful pleasures. He comes in and he says, God, I thank you so much that my life is the way it is. I thank you so much that I am able to live righteously, that I'm able to honor you with what I do. And then this other man comes in who again, by all accounts, if you asked anybody in the Jewish nation, he was not a great guy. He was the guy who stole, he was the guy who extorted people, he was the guy who wasted his money, who used people. And he comes in and he can't even look up to God, but he just looks down at the floor in shame and embarrassment, and he prays to God for mercy. Now, I've preached this passage before. There's a good chance if you've read through the New Testament, you're very familiar with it. And it's a passage I've heard preached a lot of different ways. And I want to switch our focus this morning in a little bit different direction from where we normally go. You see, often when I look at this passage, and I believe last time I preached it, we always focus on the attitudes. And look at the heart of these men. You know, this Pharisee, he may have been living a good life, and he was following the law, and he was following the commandments, but his attitude was so pompous and so arrogant. But I want to go a little bit different direction this morning. Now, the first thing I want to point out is just to make sure we're all clear that the Pharisee wasn't wrong, and neither was the tax collector. In fact, both men in their assessment of themselves were correct. Now, yes, perhaps the Pharisee was a little arrogant. Perhaps he was a little bit full of himself, but it's not necessarily clear from the passage, because really everything he's saying is true. He didn't extort people for money. He didn't use his money in sinful ways. He was not a drunkard or anything else. He wasn't an adulterer. He didn't cheat on his wife. And so what he's saying is true. He was a pretty good guy. As far as the religious standards were concerned, he was exactly what he was supposed to be. He was the guy who came to church every Sunday. He always tithed. He gave to the church. He gave of his time. He spent time during the week in prayer and fasting. He's the kind of guy as a pastor that you want to come to your church. He's the kind of person you like to see. He supports the church. He supports other people. He follows God. He follows the rules. You don't have to worry about him wearing your church t-shirt when he goes down to the bar on Saturday night. These are the kind of guys that we look for. These are the people that we recruit to our church. And so everything he says isn't wrong. He's not making this stuff up. He's not trying to make himself look better than he is. He's simply relaying the facts. He says, God, I'm not a bad guy. I appreciate the fact that I'm not living in sin. that I'm not having to worry about the consequences that I would if I were an adulterer or a drunkard or any of these other things. I don't have to worry about Roman soldiers coming and carrying me off because I broke the law. And he thanks God for the work that is done in his life. Now this other guy, this tax collector, had every reason to react the same way he did as well. Just like the Pharisee was accurate in his representation of who he was, this guy did the same thing. He wasn't a great guy. His profession, the way he spent his life, was sinful. He used people, he extorted people, he hurt people. And so, by all rights, he should have been falling down before God asking for forgiveness. Both men were correct in how they viewed themselves. And yet Jesus still rebukes the Pharisee in this passage. So then the question is, why? If it's not just about what they're saying, what was it that he did wrong? There's this idea, this principle that I've heard a number of times in the past couple weeks, and it really stuck in my head as I read this passage. And I've actually heard this two different places. Rachel and I are going through a parenting seminar on Right Now Media, and every Friday morning we sit down and we watch a 45-minute session, and then we kind of talk about it. And I heard this principle in that, and then I believe we actually talked about it at a behavior workshop at In-Service a couple days ago that Mike and I were at. And it's the idea of, in our interactions with other people, and I've been talking about it specifically with our interactions with children, but just in general, the difference between reacting and responding. And the discussion starts and is easy to think about as we think about our relationships to kids, but the difference between reacting to a situation and responding. Reacting is just when something happens, it's your instinct, it's your gut reaction, it's your emotional response. And responding to a situation is stopping and thinking and reasoning. We talk about this a lot when we're dealing with troubled kids in school. And this is, you have a kid that gets up and just starts misbehaving for no reason in the middle of class, and your initial reaction is to be rude and to be harsh, to kick them out, to punish them, to do all these things. That's reacting. Now, reacting can often make kids feel hurt, make them feel embarrassed, make them feel insecure. If a child is reacting is acting out in school because they're treated harshly at home, and then if you reinforce that behavior, it's really, really bad for them. Responding is saying, I have a student in my class who's acting out, who's misbehaving. Maybe there's a reason for it. And in what way do I need to respond to them that helps them to actually change and heal their behavior? Reacting is the emotional gut reaction, first instinct. Response is, what do I need to do? It's thinking clearly. It's making a plan beforehand of how you're going to react to a student in your class or a child. And this happens all over the place too. Adults, we can think about this at work when we're relating to coworkers or customers. Am I going to act in a way that's just flows out of my frustration or my emotion, or am I going to think about what I'm doing? And so I've had this idea in my head for the last couple weeks as it keeps kind of coming up in my life. And then I began to see it in this passage. This idea of reacting to versus responding to. Look at the Pharisee. The Pharisee is sitting here, and he's in church, he's at the altar, he's praying, and he's looking up to heaven, and he's talking to God. But it occurred to me that all of his focus was not on God. Because in contrast to the tax collector, he was looking with his eyes to heaven. But his heart wasn't. You see, this man sat there in the church, and he looked at himself, and he looked at the men around them. He looked at the tax collector and all of the other people that he had seen on the way to the temple that day, And his prayer is just dripping with reaction. Does that make sense? That he looked at all these people, including the man next to him, and said, man, I'm glad I'm not like those guys. See, it came out of his emotion, it came out of his heart, it came out of his own mind. And because he was not setting his heart on God, he was reacting to the people around him and to his situation and how he viewed himself. And then in contrast, we have this other man. We have this tax collector. You see, he was so ashamed that he could not even lift his eyes from the ground to look at God. And yet, from his attitude, from his actions, and from his words, we realize that his heart was looking straight at the Father. Because his attitude, the things he says, they're not just this gut reaction to what's going on. He's looking at a God who is good, who is forgiving, and who is loving, and he's responding by saying, look, my life's a mess. I do bad things. I am a sinner. And God, I need you to have pity on me. I need you to have mercy, and I need you to have forgiveness. See, he wasn't focused on himself or anybody else around him. You see, this man shows us what it means to really, truly be in the presence of God. What it means to really be wrapped up in who God is. And really, this tax collector, this bottom of the totem pole as far as spirituality was concerned, this guy who was rejected by the religious elite of his country, who was looked down on by everyone around him because he was such a bad guy, he shows us exactly what church is meant to be for us. It's a discussion that comes up quite often. We have people that visit our church from time to time. A lot of them stay. And a lot of them come from different faith communities or different churches that have different ways of worshiping. And I always love talking to people who come to our church for the first time, just to find out what their reaction is and what they thought about how things were here. Not in the sense of production or anything like that, but just what was it like to worship with us today? And so it's a conversation that we often have of what is church supposed to be. Is it a place where we should go and it should be all about ritual and it should all be all about symbols and doing the same thing every week? Is it a place that should be more emotional? Should it be about the experience? And I typically like to think that we kind of fall somewhere in the middle of all of these different schools of thought. But just this idea of when I go to church, what should be happening in my life? Should I fall before God and should I feel guilty for my sins, or should I be coming in with joy? And sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes we're not sure exactly how we're supposed to come before God. And it's something that I hear a lot that people, they don't know. Because the Bible talks a lot about having joy and about having hope. But the Bible also talks about being aware of how sinful we are. And so as I look at this passage, I think, what should church look like? Because clearly the tax collector here is put forth as an example. But I also don't want our church, nor does the Bible support a church where we just come in and we're depressed all the time. You know, Sunday morning shouldn't just be a place where we all come in and just realize how bad we are, gain a better understanding of how messed up our lives are, and then go home to think about it for another 7 days. And so what does this look like? How are we supposed to act? How do we relate to a God that reveals the sin in our lives? That when we look at him, we're just overwhelmed by how much smaller, by how much less significant we are than he is. And so certainly one of the things that happens, as displayed by this tax collector, is that when we walk into the presence of God, when we truly set our hearts on him, we will realize our inadequacies. We will realize how much we fall short. We will see the places in our lives where we have been unloving and uncaring, or we have been bad friends or bad children or bad parents. We will realize the mistakes that we've made, the selfish things that we have done. And we can, as this man was, be overwhelmed by the amount of sin that remains in our lives. But along with that, we can also be open. We can share with God and others our hardships and our struggles, both those that are external that come into our life and those that we cause, the hardships in our lives that are born in our own sin that we bring in. And there's a final piece of this story, and it's crucial to the understanding of the experience of this tax collector. Because if we leave it where we are right now, if we come to church and we see God, we see a God who is perfect and powerful and loving, a God who went to the cross because he was so selfless, if all we do is compare ourselves to that, if all we do is enter the throne room of God, experience his presence, and use that as a measuring stick to realize exactly how far from him we are, then we are missing the most important part of this passage and the most important part of the entire New Testament, and that is this: that this story doesn't have this tax collector coming in. It doesn't have him just falling down before God and praying and being broken. Jesus Christ himself says this: I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. You see, the tax collector's experience in church was not nearly as pleasant, as happy, as uplifting as that of the Pharisee. He wasn't in as good a mood. He wasn't joyful. He wasn't feeling full of light. He was downtrodden. He was hurt. He was emotional. He was distressed. However, he left that day being justified. Though he came in with far greater sin, he left with less of a burden. Though he came in with a life that was a mess, that was a disaster, that was not at all what God had planned for him, he left with a clean slate. You see, this passage makes it abundantly clear, a truth that we talk about often, and that is this: that Christianity is not about where you are. And if you imagine a line, and on this side is just complete depravity and sinfulness and lawlessness, and on this end of the line is God himself in complete purity and holiness. And as we start here and God begins to work in our lives, we move closer and closer to him. You see, that is the journey of the Christian. The journey of the Christian is to allow God to come into our lives and to take the sin out piece by piece and to mold us into a creation that looks more and more like him every day. And so as we journey as Christians, we move down this line until one day we will be glorified. We will be completely made whole in his image as we were intended. But church, it's not about where you fall. You see, the Pharisee was a whole lot closer to God than this tax collector was. He wasn't sinning. He wasn't using people. He was giving to the church. He was praying. And if all we do is look at the line, he was a lot closer to the kingdom than this tax collector was. But it's not about where you are. And the person that comes to the church, to our church for the third or fourth time, and they've still got the bad habits and they haven't figured out how to stop cussing yet, and they still have this problem or that problem, and they don't give like they should, or they don't do this or they don't do that. That person does not have less value than the person that's got everything together. And the family that comes in and their kids are a mess and disrespectful and disobedient, they're not better parents or worse parents in the kingdom than those whose kids behave. Because it's not about the line. Because the Pharisee was far closer to God than the tax collector was, but he did not leave justified. It's not about where you are, it's about who you're in relationship with. Where are your eyes? Where is your heart looking? Because in this passage, the guy who by all accounts is more holy is not the hero of the story. It's kind of a weird passage for Nazarenes because we're all about the holiness. But in this passage, the very thing that we strive for, the very thing that we talk the most about, it's really set aside. As far as actions, as far as living is concerned. Because there was a person in this passage, and though his life didn't look the way it was supposed to, though things had not been changed in his circumstances, though the way he was living is not the way he was supposed to live, his heart in this moment was sanctified. His heart in this moment was made clean and made whole. And he looked to God, not with his eyes, but with his heart in a way that the Pharisee didn't come close to. You see, this is the kind of relationship that God wants us to have. And yes, there will be times when we come before him and just in agony realize exactly how dark and how broken we are. But it is those moments, it is those times that we allow ourselves to fall before him that we then leave justified. See, being a Christian isn't about being anywhere on the spectrum. And I as a pastor, I want people to live better lives. I want to see people grow in holiness. I want to see people grow closer to God because the closer to him you are, the less darkness and sin you're bringing into your life. But that does not define you. You are not defined by how far you've come. You're not defined by how far you have left to go. Your relationship with God is all about your attitude and your relationship right now. So the question for us as Christians is, are we reacting? Are we setting our hearts and minds on those around us? Are we reacting spiritually out of just whatever it is that we desire? And realize too, you can react. You can be self-centered and act like this tax collector. You can come to church and just tell God how bad you are, but not have that relationship. So this isn't about don't come to church and be thankful for the good things in your life. Instead, just talk about the bad things and you'll be good to go. It's not even about the words they said, because you could come to church and react to your sin and have it not be of God. You can come in and say, God, I'm a terrible person. I'm a mess. I mess everything up. I'm full of sin. I'm sorry. And then leave. And that doesn't justify you. Because when we react to our sin, we get depressed, we get discouraged, we lose hope, and we don't allow God to change us. Because in our selfishness and our self-centeredness, we just focus on that sin. So it's not even about the words. It's not about coming and recognizing how bad we are. It's about responding to the love of God, which comes and says the same things. It says, God, I'm a sinner. God, I messed up. God, I wasn't good to my kids. God, I wasn't good to my friends. God, I was a jerk to my coworkers. But Lord, would you forgive me? Because God, if left to my own devices, if left to my own emotions, if I just react to this, I just want to give up. I just want to forget I even read this book. I just want to forget that I even was ever made aware of how good you are. Because God, it's too hard. It's too much of a task. It's too difficult. And if I were to just react to the sin in my life, I would just give up on Christianity altogether. It's too much work. It's too overwhelming. I cannot do it. Response looks at the love of God. It looks at the power of who he is when we allow him to reveal himself to us and we understand exactly how much power and ability he has. We are able to respond and say, God, I am overwhelmed by my sin. I am just overtaken by how much darkness I bring into my life. But God, you are powerful. You are loving. I need you to forgive me. I need you to justify me. I need you to make me whole. And God, I need you allow me to walk out the doors of this church knowing that my slate is clean in your eyes. That it's not about coming to church, thinking about how bad we are, and then leaving feeling the same way. It's about coming to church, realizing where we fall short, and giving God the opportunity to change it, to change our hearts, to change our actions. Because guess what? This Pharisee, he didn't leave church that day any different than when he came in. He left church exactly the same. The guy that walked in and the guy that walked out were identical. But this tax collector, he walked in a sinner and he left a saint. He walked in a man that was overcome with sin and brokenness, whose identity was all wrapped up in the bad things that he had done, and he walked out. As he went back down to his house, he left a man that was changed, a man that no longer had guilt, a man that no longer had punishment, a man that no longer had darkness in his life, but he was different. See, if all you're doing as a Christian is reacting to whatever's around you, you're in charge. And guess what? You can't change you. You can be yourself, but you can't change yourself. The only person who can change you is Him when you respond. When you look authentically at who He is, when you understand His power and His love, and you let that influence you to change your life. I see so many Christians that just react one way or another, that their whole Christian walk is this giant emotional just tennis match of back and forth and back and forth. And they never actually get anywhere. They just kind of run around in circles because they're not allowing God to change them. They're trying to change themselves after learning a little bit about who He is. And there's a difference. The Pharisee knew all about God, and he used that to try and change his life. And because of that, this day, nothing happened. The tax collector allowed God to deeply influence him, to truly know who God was. And in his response, he left a completely changed person. Is that how you view church? Is that how you walk in this building every Sunday? Is that how you go to your small groups? Is that how you go to your devotional and your prayer times? You see, church, that's what I think we need to be. We need to come here prepared to lay everything out, to look honestly at who we are, to fall down before God, but then to allow Him to pick us back up. So we're not just coming to church to be excited about how great we are, and we're not coming to church to just be depressed about how bad we are. Neither one of those is right. What's right is the attitude that allows us to see God and for Him to change us and make us a new creation every time we walk into His presence.